Good afternoon. This is Jim Ray with the Road to the Autry Masters. We're talking with artists of the Masters of the American West. Today, we are thrilled to have with us Walter Matia. Walter is a nationally recognized sculptor. I'm tempted to call him an avian sculptor because most of his work is avian in nature, though he's not exclusively that way. Welcome, Walter. Thanks for coming to Road to the Autry Masters.
Thanks, Jim. Looking forward to talking with you.
So, Walter, you're a member of the National Sculpture Society, the Society of Animal Sculptors. You're in the Prix de West. You're in the Masters of the American West. You've won major awards at pretty much every show you've gone to. Why don't you share with us a little bit about your artistic upbringing? How you got into being an artist and what was that like?
Well, I suspect that most of our stories are about the same, to be honest with you.
Actually not. They're quite varied.
Well, I mean, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and we had a fabulous art museum there, and we had a fabulous natural history museum. And I spent, I would say, most of my youth in one of the others of those two institutions.
That's a sure sign of a misspent youth.
Yeah, well, I actually sort of went to work at the Natural History Museum when I was about 14.
Okay.
It was at a time when, kids could do that kind of thing. I feel sorry for my own kids. It seems like a world a long way away, but I pretty much spent every weekend and every vacation and every summer in the basement of the Natural History Museum in their exhibits department. I worked with the taxidermist, a man named Larry Izzard, who was also a terrific sculptor. And I learned an awful lot of anatomy. And the woman who was the director of exhibits, a wonderful person named Ellen Walters, she basically lets you do anything that you didn't screw up. Along that was for management style. And so I wound up painting backgrounds for dioramas and putting together different displays on glacial geology. And they basically just let you do anything that you didn't do badly, and if you did it badly, they gave you something easy to do. Mm-hmm. And if you did it well, they gave you something harder to do. And it was a great management lesson, if nothing else. I then went on to college, and I got a degree in biology. And about 2/3 of the way through that, I realized I was really more interested in art. And so I got a double major in art, or in biology and art. I was an intaglio printmaker at the time.
Okay.
Went on to work for an organization called the Nature Conservancy for about 13 years, which may sound like a diversion, but it in fact took me to all of the great wild places in North America. And at the same time, I was able to visit lots and lots of smaller museums around the country, which I did. So that's sort of the history of it. And then finally, about 1986 or 87, I quit my job at the Nature Conservancy to spend full-time sculpting.
So, as I mentioned earlier, you've achieved pretty high esteem in this business. You're heavily recognized, widely awarded. What was it like for you to progress your career from a starting point of just being a sculptor to operating up in this rarefied air of museum exhibitions and so forth?
There's a popular book. A guy named Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Outliers. Mm-hmm. And there were 2 or 3 premises in it. One was that it took 10,000 hours.
10,000 hours to achieve anything.
But that wasn't the point that hit me the most at that. And the point that hit me the most was that none of us get where we are alone. And I started out with great education from a guy named Larry Izzard. And then in about 1986 or 87, I can't remember exactly when it was, I had the enormous good fortune to be in a small gallery in Jackson, Wyoming, looking at a painting by a guy named Bill Reece. Mm-hmm. And I was talking to the gallery assistant, and I said, "God, who's this?" I mean, it was just wonderful. It was a pileated woodpecker in an apple tree.
Mhm.
And she said, "Oh, that's Bill Reece, and he's walking up the stairs right now." And he and Fran Reece were walking up the stairs, and I was still working for the Nature Conservancy, I think. Anyway, we met, we talked, we went out to lunch, and we spent the afternoon together, and then we went out to dinner. And it was the sort of turning point in what I chose to do and how I chose to go at this profession. And I think almost all of us have had at least somebody in our lives that sort of grabbed us by the ear and said, "Okay, you know, this is what you need to be able to do." In Bill's case, he was such an amazing student of our profession. His book collection, his knowledge, the number of people who he had known was tremendous, and he was the most generous man I ever met. And I spent probably 20 years just with Bill pounding on me. So I mean, if I had to say, you know, how did I progress through this, I would lay it at Bill's feet to start, and then as you go to different shows, you meet different people who inspire you. I do and have done for years a small show up in Wisconsin called Birds in Art, and at that exhibition, it's a worldwide exhibition. At that exhibition, the same year, I met Jim Morgan and Steve Kestrel.
Okay.
And they became really my closest friends in this business. And if you spend your time with people who are working hard to be really good at something, you either realize how hard it is to get good at it and you try harder yourself, or you bail out. In my case, I kept working hard at it, and you know, the friends I've made along the way in this, they really define where I am and how I got
Yeah. You know, I think the friendships are exceedingly important. I mean, from our point of view as collectors, we've made hundreds of friendships with important artists around the country, and watch their work progress as they do their thing, or as they change their thing in some cases, and try to move into a different direction. And we value those friendships greatly. And I understand exactly what you're talking about. And of course, Jim Morgan and Steve Kestrel are also fellow artists in the Masters show. And it's interesting, but not surprising that that you kind of banded up with them and moved through the process with them. So,
well, you know, I mean, depending on where you're from, I am a creature of the East. I mean, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and I've lived my whole life in Maryland, Virginia, and you know, I've lived stints out west, but I hadn't been west of Detroit until I was like 21 years old.
mhm.
And I remember going into the museum in Cleveland, and they had one or two Western paintings. And I remember looking at the light in the paintings and just kind of going, "This is impossible. These people were crazy. It can't look like this."
Yeah, and it did.
And I remember getting off the plane the first time, and I think it was 1972. I got off the plane in Jackson, Wyoming, to go fishing with some friends, and got off the plane, looked at the Tetons, and it was like the scales were struck from my eyes.
Yeah,
I mean, like, oh my God, it is that clear. You can see that far. So, you know, the given where I was from, I think if I hadn't met Bill, you know, you could take your tradition any number of places. But Bill introduced me to people who were painting the West and sculpting more Western images. I never got into what people would call classic Western imagery, and that, you know, I never was surrounded by elk or bears or moose, so I had nothing to say about it. So, but I was surrounded by cranes and herons and game birds of the West, and the hunting tradition and fishing tradition of the West. And
right.
so that's what I concentrate on.
Yeah, and for those of you who may not be familiar with the Masters and the range of work that's in the Masters, wildlife is an important segment of the work that we present at that exhibition, and both in two-dimensional paintings and three-dimensional sculpture. And we're talking to one of the best of the breed in doing that. Speaking of that, let's talk a little bit about what you're sending to us this year. I think the first thing that you mentioned is a raven, and I'll lay images behind this video as you talk about it, so people will know what you're talking about. What's the story with your raven?
Well, I mean, frankly, there are some birds that are simply so iconic, and they're sort of iconic in the West. And the hard part about doing a bird that is so familiar is that you're dealing with people's perceptions of it, and you're just trying to, I mean, I try and figure out what is it that people don't know about them that I can bring to them through what I try and do. And this particular piece is really just talking about this sort of the savagery of winter. Mm-hmm. And in fact, sort of the loneliness of it. And so I sort of played around with a couple of different icons of the West, sort of the remains of an old bison with a raven on top of it. And I hope it isn't too cliche, but I liked the forms. I needed something that was going to hold a big enough mass. I like doing birds at this scale simply because they allow you to actually sculpt them, not model them. Mm-hmm. You can really work the surfaces, and you can really play with how light can be thrown back from the different surface changes that you put into it. And
so what are the approximate dimensions on this particular work?
The piece is life size, so I don't know. Maybe it's
20, okay, so it's life size. That's
maybe it's 20, 20, 20, 23, 23, 20, something like that.
Right. Yeah.
And then the second piece is a kingfisher, and what was the impetus for it? The impetus was a dear friend of mine loved kingfishers and asked me to do one for his wife.
That'll do it.
And so then you wind up with the same problem. How do you get something that people? Well, it's a problem with birds in general. I mean, how do you attain elevation and lightness to something that is so that's basically so full of life, and yet you're trying to do it in metal. And so a lot of my challenge in this is to pick a silhouette that was sort of definitively kingfisherish, and then come up with a way of getting it up in the air that showed both a lightness of touch and sort of an indication of there was air all around it.
Yeah.
And so that was the challenge. This actually was just half of the sculpture I did for the guy. The piece that I did for him was with two birds, and was about 6 or 7 feet tall. But I liked this particular bird, and the 6-foot version of it was just complicated. Yeah. I'll leave it at that.
Well, I've seen several of your works that have got not just the subject, but the surrounding of the subject very artfully presented, and it just speaks to the quality of your design, that you don't just focus on the subject, but you often focus on where that subject can be found. And so, talk a little bit about. You just said that this one was one because a friend asked you to do it, but what is the normal process for deciding what's going to lead you into a particular project? What's going to lead you into sculpting a particular subject?
If I went back to that same answer, it would be about 85% of the way there. I mean, most of the stuff that I do is from friends asking me to do something, and I can't say no to them.
Fair enough.
I don't, every once in a while, I will have something. I'll just have sort of a wild hair that I just really want to do. And, a couple of years ago, I just got very interested in blackbirds. I love blackbirds for whatever reason, yellow-headed blackbirds, red-winged blackbirds. And I started doing some of them, and frankly, it led to me proposing to other people projects with blackbirds.
Okay.
So it became, the initial just interest in them as animals and as forms. And, and I will also say an awful lot of what I wind up doing when you say that I tend to include sort of a larger habitat or whatever in with what I'm doing. An awful lot of why I do the bird or the dog or the whatever is because of the habitat I saw it in.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost an excuse. I've done for years different marsh scenes, and I just find the organization or the organizational beauty of how reeds, this incredible random organization of grasses and reeds. And if you can catch that, if you can catch all the beautiful negative spaces, you almost don't need the bird in it. I mean, they're just like these murals. I did for a number of years. I got involved making fire screens just because they were
seen a couple of those.
And what they are is they're just silhouettes. I mean, they're just organizations of vegetation and some other animal in them, because you realize that you're designing them to be seen basically in silhouette, fire behind it where you don't see the surface. It's just a black and white, and that's just always been interesting. I loved going in cathedrals and seeing the ironwork, and it always sort of moved me that the ironworker Samuel Yellen, who did the great gates at Yale's Harkness Tower and a number of pieces in the National Cathedral in Washington, and sort of a lot of great houses in the Pittsburgh and Cleveland areas had Samuel Yellen ironwork gates.
Yeah. Over the course of your career, has your process changed? Has it evolved? How might it have gone from your beginning days to where you are now and where you might be going in the future?
Well, you start out, everybody starts out just trying to do as many things as they can, as fast as they can, so that they can make enough mistakes so that they can make some progress. I mean, there's no way to do this on the cheap. You just got to do a lot of stuff. And so if anything has changed, it's that I've just gotten much, hopefully, better at deciding what is really worth thinking about. Not what we're doing, but what questions do I really want to answer with the pieces before I set out to do them. So it slowed me down a great deal. I mean, things that I used to just whip through now seem to take me forever because I keep making change after change after change. And part of that is just I'm older and I don't need any more bad bronzes out there. And part of it is that your yardsticks keep getting more and more finely calibrated as to what actually is really good. Sometimes, I just got back from the Sargent in Spain show at the National Gallery, and after spending about 5 hours in that place, well, I spent 2 hours in the exhibit, I guess, but you come home and you don't know whether you're inspired or you want to slit your wrists. But what you do realize is that when you then go back to, you look at your own work and you think, okay, I can make this better. I mean, I still have to keep pushing on this. I still have to keep pushing on this. And I think all that's really changed in what I do is I just spend so much more time on pieces. The other thing is that all this stuff is getting too heavy. And so I'm doing more and more smaller pieces than I used to do, just because I just can't manipulate it. It's no fun.
George Carlson was an amazing sculptor and completely got out of the game. He moved over to being an amazing landscape painter because physically he couldn't do the sculpture anymore. His hands couldn't take it. So there is
George had one. I mean, one of the great lines that George said. He said, "Yeah, he said sculpture is like big game painting. You pull the trigger, and then all the work starts."
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
and like so I can sculpt this stuff. I don't, the physically sculpting it isn't such a big problem. It's just then what do you do? Then cutting it up and getting it molded, then getting to the foundry, then you
it's a
get
lot
it
of
back.
work.
And then you get it to the client, and the client expects you to install it. You're like, well, no, I can't do that anymore. And that used to be so much of the fun of it. And so I gotta come up with a new circus.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Well, Walter, I surely appreciate your taking the time to talk with us today and sharing some of your views and insights about the work that you do. I know you may have a challenge at joining us at the Masters this year. I think there might be some competing things on your schedule, but in the event that you do join us, we would love to see you. And if you don't, we wish you all the best anyway. And thanks so much for coming on and talking with us.
Thank you. I mean, Masters is it's a wonderful show, and what I think is the best about it is that it really has tried to look at a broader range of what artists have to say about the West than some of the other more classic Western art shows. And you've chosen a hard thing to do, and I really respect you for doing it.
Yeah, and we've taken a certain amount of heat for it as well. And I think we have to thank Amy, who is the lead curatorial energy behind the Masters, for her efforts to move the show in a new direction. And we're constantly on the lookout for the kind of artists that we want to continue to have artists that represent the traditional West, but at the same time, we want to bring artists to the table that have a new vision of the West as well. And that particularly works well in our Los Angeles marketplace. So
yeah, absolutely.
So a lot easier to do than in Oklahoma City or San Antonio or places like that.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think that the Coors does a pretty good job as well.
Well, actually, I did an analysis last year, and I went and made a list of all the artists that I considered to be contemporary artists in our show. And then I went and looked at the Idle George, I looked at the Briscoe, I looked at the Cowboy Show. And the Cowboy Show had 18 of the 20 artists in there. But they've got so many artists that it's not as apparent as a somewhat smaller show that we've got at the Masters. The Cowboy Show's got a footprint that's probably 2.5 times the size of the footprint that we've got at our museum.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought of it quite that way.
Yeah, but most of them are there. Not so much in the Briscoe and in the Idle George, but they've got their smattering of contemporary artists as well. So
Yeah.
I think that both are interesting stories to tell, and we love to see those stories, and we're very fortunate to have both of those types of artists participate with us in the show.
Yeah. Well, again, I think that when I think of the shows that you mentioned, the place that I would go to see the more contemporary work would be the Masters.
Yeah, I think so.
Just a much broader range of it, and nobody has a magic wand that says what people are going to think is good 30 years from now. True. You basically just have to have a curator's eye, and I think Amy does, of saying, okay, the world should see this, and they should see it in conjunction with other things. And I think that's where you really serve a wonderful purpose of showing that it's not one or the other. It's both.
Yeah.
And both of them basically complement, and both have different things to say, and they look right together. Good art looks right with good art. It's not.
And I think the most important thing that we try to do is we try to look for people that are doing amazing work. And I think we've been pretty successful at finding that.
Yeah, well, there are some amazing people out there, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It's and it's, you know, I mean, when I think about the trajectory of my short career and part in that trajectory, you know, I'm kind of going to remember that at the end of the day, I will have met 25 or 30 of the people that sort of defined, you know, late 20th century representational work.
True.
That's pretty amazing when I think about it.
It's really amazing.
You know, it's like,
is really
what the
amazing.
heck?
Yeah.
You know, I could be painting duck stamps.
All right, Walter. Well, thank you so
All right.
much.
Bye-bye.